Good evening and welcome to the Viva Cost podcast. My name is Graham Spence and tonight I'm joined on this special episode with Alison Graham. Can you hear me, Alison?
I can hear you fine, Graham. How are you?
I am very good. I am very good. We are having a special night because this is the evening before the vote opens for the new SNP leader and First Minister of Scotland. It is going to be a terribly exciting competition, I do think.
I do indeed, yeah. It's the first time there's been a contest in about 20 years, so that in itself is pretty significant. And I think the fact it is for the First Minister as well has got the country interested. It's not just SNP members.
It's definitely exciting. I mean, something you said there, it's been 20 years. It has been about 20 years. Interestingly, the rule books haven't been updated in that time. So the rule books were, they were anticipating. We blogged about this. A lot of people have told me I was wrong about my timeline. Actually, I wasn't wrong about the timeline. It's just that the NEC decided quite literally to unilaterally collapse the timeline, have a much quicker timeline and get the new First Minister and the new SNP leader in place a lot quicker than probably they expected. So It's been an interesting thing. I think tonight we're just doing a little bit of coverage on some of the main themes that we've taken from the candidates and certainly how to utilise the voting strategy. Or have I got tonight's episode completely wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think, over the kind of coming, days and weeks, we'll start looking more at unpacking the actual election itself, because I think there's something really interesting in what you said when we previously blogged about this and looked at the Constitution. I think it was 77 days, the contest. And people have just interestingly just accepted that it's been restricted to a shorter campaign, even though there's a few reasons that that's maybe got quite an impact on the contest, particularly for the less known candidate, Ash Regan. So I think we'll start unpacking some of that as kind of days go on. But yeah, today I think we should be looking at what's happened so far, where the candidates have been, what the topics of conversation have been at hustings and TV debates, which is interesting because we're kind of used to seeing that obviously at a UK level with the Tory leadership, which seems to change fairly frequently, the seasons, if you like. But it's very, very unusual in Scotland because, as I say, it's not happened to the party government for 20 years.
No. I think you said something on one of our previous podcasts. We were talking about the road to Scottish independence and how one of the big obstacles to Scottish independence is that we said once in a generation, and obviously a generation had not passed. However, with the changing of the guard of the SNP, I believe that now means that all the parties that are represented in Holyrood have a new leader.
Exactly.
A generation has passed.
Exactly. So I think the only one that's still there, because we talk a lot about the kind of, my kind of line of, can old faces make new cases, particularly, from the 2014 faces. I think Patrick Harvey's probably the only one that's still in post. He's a kind of co-leader of the Greens with now Lorna Slater, who's a kind of new face on the scene in the last few years. But certainly from the 2014, political leaders, Patrick Harvey's really the only one that's left. And it seems to be more Lorna Slater that's coming to the front of the Green Party than Patrick Harvey.
Bizarrely there, though. I mean, 20% of the Greens are party leaders, and I think 85% of them are senior Greens. So, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see the passing of the guard there. More and more people get added to the top level. So let me dig into it. 3 candidates.
Yeah.
We didn't think it was going to be 3 candidates. We thought there was going to be 4. We always thought that Angus Robertson was going to jump in there, and then he didn't.
Generally accepted for a while that would be the reason he was not standing at Westminster but stood in Holyrood instead.
Indeed. I think, I mean, I don't know anything, but I would suggest it's very odd that he has not stood forward, and I think that I'm not entirely buying the whole it's because he's children. I don't know if that would be it. I think he's possibly looking at a longer term aspiration, or he's certainly, there's probably something else there that I'll unpack.
I agree. I think it's interesting because Angus Robertson actually used that before. What the reason he didn't stand in 2019 is he had a young family. And then he promptly stood in 2021, where he still had a young family. So I was entirely, I thought, that's a bit of a kind of spend more time with my family. Remember when Ruth Davidson stepped down, spend more time with her family, and then promptly took a job in London in the Lords, and as a journalist. So sometimes, what I think we take at face value, when you look back, you think, does that really...
Yeah, the rear view mirror is definitely...
Yeah, exactly.
So we're in a situation now where we've got the three candidates. We've got Hamza Yousaf, we have Kate Forbes, and we have Ash Regan.
Yeah.
And it's fair to say, I think, that we have three. Initially, it seemed like we had three very similar. We're going to see much difference. Is there going to be much pulled out here? Is it going to be just another they were all going to be continuity candidates. However, it's completely changed from that. I would say we've now got into a situation where we only have one continuity candidate. I would say Hamza Yousaf is very much, from watching the online hustings and from watching some of the interviews, he's very complimentary to Nicola Sturgeon in the sense, well, if she can't solve it, I'll not be able to, which is a really odd pitch if you're trying to be the new leader.
It's a very odd pitch, particularly when you're trying to move things on, particularly with independence, because Nicola Sturgeon's been in role as the longest FM in Scotland for 9 years, pretty much. So it is a really odd...
Nicola Sturgeon...
She couldn't do it.
Nicola Sturgeon... Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, you go.
I was going to say, Nicola Sturgeon, in some ways was coronated as the continuation of the Alex Salmond era.
That's
and,
right.
I know that the Sturgeon's people and Sturgeon's, followers will be absolutely horrified to hear that Nicola Sturgeon continued all the policies of Alex Salmond, but she did free prescriptions, free, concessionary travel for over 65s, concessionary travel for under 22s was also a salmon-generated policy, although it was never implemented until it was Nicola Sturgeon. It was debated at conference. She continued along with the free university care. When you ask somebody, can you point to a Sturgeon policy that was successful or is deployed in actual law, you quite often get stuck at the baby box. So in many ways, Nicola Sturgeon, to her credit, by the way, managed to maintain a lot of the salmon area policies that came from the 2007-2011 elections that then propelled the party to electoral success. So, Nicola Sturgeon in some ways was a continuity candidate herself. You couldn't say she wasn't. She went unopposed and was coronated by the party rather than, elected to the party. From that... Yeah. Do you want to cut in there? Because you probably have some interest.
I was just going to say, one of the things, I agree, when we used to put out leaflets, one of the ones that was most popular was the kind of concertina one with all the achievements. And it had the baby box.
Z-fold, I remember it.
Z-fold. And it had the baby box on the front. And that was actually probably the most well-landed leaflet, I think, that the SNP ever did. That was one that seemed to have some content where a lot of the other parties were putting out just, pretty fluff. So it's one of these things, you and I have talked a lot about leaflets and our views on leaflets, which is probably a whole other podcast. But, if you're going to put something out, you either put it out very short and sharp, or you do, here's a concertina with all the achievements. It was quite an interesting leaflet. It wasn't big, but most of the things on there, and at conference, they used to kind of paint them on the stairs and stuff as you went up the steps to conference. And most of the stuff did come out of the parliament that we've always said was the most productive parliament, which interestingly was a minority parliament, was the 2007 to 2011 parliament. So even the Queensferry Crossing, which was where Ash Regan launched her campaign, which is generally seen as a magnificent achievement for Scotland and for the SNP government, it landed, it opened in Nicola Sturgeon's era, but it commenced, the whole inception of the idea and get that together all came in the 2007 and 2011 Parliament. So I think it shows you what you can do with the kind of more Nordic style consensus government. So there's a big push now to worry about what happens if you lose the Greens, and it's like when did that ever? Would they not vote through a budget? And I know that Bruce Crawford, who was my MSP, did a lot of work trying to build consensus across the Parliament to get budgets passed, etc. And there was. When they did actually get that parliament, they did think they would collapse the government quite quickly, that they would never get anything passed. And actually, by being quite reasonable and working across party to build consensus that was quite hard to argue with, they actually achieved a lot. You remember the George Fawkes comment of but they're doing all this stuff but they're doing it deliberately. They're making Scotland look good, but they're doing it deliberately. And it was like that showed you the prism of you stop looking at the benefit of Scotland and you're starting to look at the partisan benefits. And I think Labour did that to their cost. And I think, from having a very secure vote in Scotland, 2015 was a huge, tsunami change in the political landscape in Scotland. And I think, again, we could very well be starting to move towards something like that. I think if the SNP are not very careful. Labour are definitely circling the wagons at the moment.
That's true, but the Labour Party have a unique ability to go into an election thinking they're going to win it and then absolutely
They do tend to snatch defeat from jaws of victory, I have to say. Certainly at a UK level particularly, and I wouldn't bank on a majority in a UK Parliament either. If they do topple the Tories, I think it would be quite marginal.
I think, we're in a situation, this is something that we brought up before. It's rare that a political party gets to have more than 4 terms. It's very rare.
Yeah.
So the SNP are in for a bit of bruising, to be fair. The Conservatives down south are in for a bit of bruising. So you may end up in that sort of sneak situation where the Labour Party does well at a UK level and then does well in Scotland by proxy. However, I'm not convinced. Scottish Labour's talent pool, if I can call it a talent pool, is shallow. Monica Lennon might be the one person in there who I think, contributes well above the average for the whole party. The rest of it is absolutely diabolically dire. There's nothing there. They're not a government in waiting. They couldn't be a government in waiting. The grandees that they have in there and the noise that they have contained within that party is all, the sons and daughters of the old lot who are probably harking on in the background about when Scotland used to know its Labour roots and nonsense like that. Labour, there was famously, there was a Labour politician that was going on and he said, Labour was built in the mines of Scotland, it was built in the coal mines and the trade unions and blah. They've not noticed, the coal mines aren't here anymore. You have to evolve your policy to the electorate you have, not the electorate that you once had. And I think that's possibly where the SNP, and Humza being a continuity candidate, has possibly, I'm not sure. So, from what I've been seeing anyway, Humza Yousaf is putting forward Nicola Sturgeon, very bright individual, copy everything Nicola Sturgeon does. If she couldn't beat the UK government, I don't think I could, so stop asking me questions on that. All the big questions he seems to defer to, let's go back and rally Nicola Sturgeon, who, by the way, did not solve these issues. Nicola Sturgeon, we're not an SNP blog, we're a pro-independence blog, so we are going to be those critical friends. And we are going to have to say that Nicola Sturgeon, sounded good. She was great on the world stage. She was a great ambassador for Scotland in the sense she went out there and she sounded and looked good on TV, but she didn't actually achieve anything. In the independence game, a lot of rhetoric, a lot up the hill, down the hill, a lot up the hill, and then back down the hill again. She was very successful in elections, deploying the strategy of independence 6 months before, and then very quickly putting it back in the can 10 minutes after the election actually occurred. So we've had Nicola Sturgeon continuity, and we've had I don't know how to say this without sounding ridiculous, but there's an advocation in the SNP, and Humza Yousaf is standing on a platform, presumably to try and take a swipe at Kate Forbes under her religious views. And his platform is that he is going to be super progressive. He's going to put the boosters on progressiveness, and he's going to accelerate it through the roof. And we're going to live in this magical land, absolute progression for every right that's never existed. And this is where, I struggle, because I'm not entirely sure modern Scotland is some sort of non-progressive environment. We're probably one of the most hospitable environments for being yourself and having, your views and your expressions known. I would say that Scotland's probably one of the beacons of the world. Scotland is a country that many try to emulate. In fact, many do try and emulate us, and they quote us in their scripture in Parliament, and they quote us in their media about how progressive and out there Scotland is. So again, we have worldwide arts festivals that celebrate the ability for freedom of speech and freedom of expression in this country. So again, Humza Yousaf is standing on a platform that I think we already have. I don't think we live in a country where, I don't know, you're open to disagree with me here. Do you think we live in a country where, particularly minority groups find a hard recognition? I didn't think we did.
Well, I think
maybe that's just.
I think it's really. I think all countries have to absolutely look to themselves and always try and seek to find out, are we taking things for granted or can we do anything better? But I think culturally, even like the whole all Doc Tamson's bairns, and you look at like Scotland being the first part of the UK to pass equal marriage act. So I think we do have a track record, and on the one hand, we talk about Scotland being open and inclusive and welcoming, and we're a country, as McIlvaney called us, a mongrel nation, and proudly so. That we are a country of both immigrants and emigrants. Scotland, like the Irish, travelled the world through, necessity, through a lot of our history. But we welcome, like rich cultures, and of course you get problems, in any society. But I mean, some people would have a fight in an empty house. Let's be honest. People fight amongst themselves for anything, whether it's a football team or what have you. There's always the dangers of division if you don't find some common ground that you can move forward from, or common values that you can respect differences. And I think again, as the country of the Enlightenment, it was all about robust evidence debate, and that's where great thinking came from, and great feats of judiciary and engineering and science advances in Scotland. And I think that's something that we've got a very kind of proud tradition of. So I do think it's really odd. There's a couple of things I think is really odd about Hamza's position, and that is, as you say, that he is kind of positioned himself as this progressive candidate, which seems a wee bit like running on like one of these running machines. You're not actually going anywhere. You're frantically turning your legs, but not actually moving any further forward, because you're kind of fairly down the road already. Absolutely, we should always check that we're not going backwards in rights and protections. But to focus when we've got a blatant issue with poverty that scars our land, across all protected characteristics and none. With kids going to bed cold and hungry, and an energy-rich nation. I mean, we're an abundant nation of resources and talent. That is something that can bring us together to common purpose. Look.
You're right.
And there's a lot of chat now going on about eradicating poverty, which, I heard Kate saying that, and I know she visited a place that I've done some work in, quite close to me, and it's like, I've seen a few things about poverty. I mean, I'm not slagging people off, but, it's kind of laudable. But to say that you'll eradicate poverty when you are, trapped by the walls of devolution and you're not a currency creator is frankly for the birds. You can't eradicate, but if you can eradicate poverty, why have they not done it in 15 years in the developed government?
The other thing is, and I'm going to be quite controversial here, and I'm aware there's a poverty alliance, hustings, everything, and this is why I couldn't be a politician, because bluntly, any politician that runs on the idea we're going to eradicate poverty, while they're not advocating demonstrable change to either the economy, the finances, or the structural running of the country.
Yeah.
You're not. I mean, the truth is, nobody is against poverty eradication. I mean, this isn't some sort of game. If you ask, you can ask some of the world's richest people. You can ask, for example, Bill Gates. You can get him on. But we can't. I wish we could get Bill Gates in the podcast, but if you go and ask him, he's dedicated his life to getting rid of some of the most communicable diseases, such as malaria, getting off the planet, and he's doing so out of his philanthropy.
Yep.
And the idea that people aren't interested in poverty, even at the top end of the income scale, is farcical. It's not that anybody thinks poverty should exist. It's not that anybody thinks it shouldn't be done away with. The problem is, though, you have many things that drive poverty in the country.
Yeah.
It's not always just income inequality, which is a huge part of it, but you've also got things like, unless you structurally have a look at how housing is developed and paid for, if you have a look at how energy is
how
employed and paid for,
income is spent because of where you live.
Yeah, it's in that. You've also got to move in there the other blights that Scotland has, which alcohol and drugs, and once you have to wrap it all together to get a full picture. It's not. I get bored of candidates, and I'm not taking a swipe at any of them in particular here, but I get bored of people who come forward and say something that is clearly just a populist line of "I am going to focus on poverty," but then don't back it up. And the problem is that when speaking about poverty, you need to speak about the structural, constitutional, functional, systemic issues
Yes.
of a country. There's no point in worrying about, oh well, we're going to put £10 in a pay packet here, or we're going to give everybody a sweetie. It's not as easy as that.
No.
It is a structural issue.
But there's
And
low hanging
there's no-
fruit. There's low hanging fruit that, you know, is what I would call the kind of pause for applause at things like hustings
Yeah.
and debates. And it's these lines that media run with, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But how's it costed? And with a fixed budget, if you're giving that extra money to childcare, 1 to 2 childcare, where are you taking it from? You know, who's not getting the money? So exactly, without real systemic change, and systemic change, no matter what way you look at it, Scotland cannot do this in their current constitutional position. We are a currency taker. We do not control all the levers. We've got limited tax powers. We've got limited borrowing powers, and we can't create currency. We don't have a central bank.
This is why I get totally frustrated, and you're 100% right on this. And I get 100% frustrated when people say we can't be seen to be talking out about independence because crisis 1, crisis 2, functional issue 3 is currently clouding the media. Because the truth is that independence, and I know that the unions hate this, and I know that normal people who are watching this loathe anybody mentioning this, but all the solutions to this are either, Westminster completely reforming itself into some sort of federal society that can actually, take cognizance at individual areas. Let's park that, because that's never going to happen. So let's put that out the periphery and say that the solutions to all these problems for Scotland, believe it or not, and unhelpfully to everybody who complains about this, are actually independence. Our independence allows us to tackle some of these things. It allows us to transition. It allows us to transition from the focus that we currently have to the focus that we should have, and that is it. However, we're going to go over time. I mean, we had a half an hour budget. We're definitely going to go over half an hour because we're at minute 22 already.
Can I just say one thing to that, because it really frustrates me, is that people seem to think independence and the cost of living and everything else is an either or. But if you're on a road to independence and you're starting to think like an independent country, what we need, you will then push devolution to its walls. Because that is, you're doing all you can with your existing powers and demonstrating what you want to do beyond those walls, but you can't do. If you're trying to convince people of the limitation of devolution, you have to stretch devolution to its walls. And I don't think that's been done over the last 15 years. Broadcasting was brought up, I think, with one of the candidates in Dumfries, was it Ash Regan, was saying about the borders and it's not STV there, it's border television, etc. So the fact that we don't have, it's a wider picture. We don't have devolved broadcasting, and it was brought up, I think, with Ash Regan as well, that Catalonia have a number of broadcast TV stations from with an independence point of view, and that these things are actually enablers to get the conversation across. Because we complain about the media, but nobody's done anything about it. Nobody's actually done anything to try and...
You're right. And I mean, it's interesting because after that complaint got picked up, it got flung around, oh God, we're going so over time, it's not even funny. But that got picked up by the media. And it's funny because ITV Borders then showed the STV debate in the ITV border region with day and time parity. So it's really interesting because the minute someone highlighted it, the minute there was a tiny little bit of light on this and there was a suggestion, just a mere suggestion. I mean, I doubt Ash Regan's got a media company in her back garden that she can deploy. But the minute she just suggested that Scotland has to set up a pro-independence or, a media company that could cover this, instantly we were able to change the schedule and cover the debate and send it to the whole Borders region. It was hilarious. In one day we were able to do it. So it shows you the power of actually thinking outside the box.
Exactly. And the power of suggestion. If you don't actually come up with the ideas, how do you ever change anything? We don't ever change things from continuity. We change things by looking at problems differently.
Well, there was something she cast up. She casts it up. And despite the fact she was roundly mocked by some of the unionist media, she was very quickly proven right because somebody with editorial control went, we should probably fix this. Moving on though, Moving on, we've done Hamza Yousaf. He's the continuing candidate. We've got Kate Forbes. Kate had an interesting start. She got labelled as basically some sort of Bible thumping, religious nutcase that could you let her anywhere near us because she was going to all of a sudden drag us back to 1702 and she was going to, have us. I mean, I don't think it helped by the fact that her launch video was her sat on a rock. I mean, Hamza was we should cover them all, actually. Yeah. Hamza, you've said Ash Regan was over the Queensferry crossings. Yeah. Hamza Yousaf was in a community hall under an exit sign, which I thought
that was hilarious. I was like, who thought about that?
And then Kate was on a rock in the middle of nowhere. And a lot of story blocks-esque or somebody who owns a drone took a lot of footage of some very nice hills and some very nice valleys and some very nice scenery, but otherwise Kate launched. I've got to say, if I was saying that she's appealing to an awful lot of members who will also be in the central belt and the cities, it did paint her as a little bit out of touch with the concerns of the people who live in populated areas. But also, she then went into a week and a half, get out there and defend the Free Church of Scotland and its views. And I believe her communications person is also the communications manager for the Free Church of Scotland. It all got a bit muddy. It all got a bit cloudy. I mean, I felt sorry for her in some ways because I think what she wanted to talk about was clearly the priorities of the country. But the presentation style, the questions that she must have known were coming, and the video she done were effectively up in this remote rock. It really, the imagery, not to ruin it for her, but the imagery made her look out of touch, and the thing she was saying was out of touch, and I think that's why the initial campaign was branded out of touch. Yeah. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think they probably went deliberately for the religion thing early so that they had the time. So I think that was quite strategic, to be honest. I mean, I think Kate announcing at all, I mean, for quite a long time, people have thought, yeah, Kate Forbes would be a First Minister for the future, but probably not now. She's a bit inexperienced, whatever. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, it just depends who you're up against, because nobody thought it would be Hamza that was the candidate, the continuity candidate. There was a raft of people suggested, because we've said ourselves, in fact, the blog from, what was it, There's a Hole in the Ship blog, when we said there's a tipping point here, once the water starts coming in too many places, you can't bail it out anymore. And, Nicola Sturgeon did look as if she was going to be coming to the end of her political career. But we didn't.
So we got it right, Alison?
So rapidly.
Are you saying we got it right ahead of everyone else?
Well, do you know what? It's just, if you watch the way the kind of wind blows and different things that happen, you just kind of rationally you get to a certain point. You think, if you're somebody who's run the party and largely the country with a very tight control, then once you start to lose that control, it becomes very difficult of how you operate, particularly if that's the kind of personality that you are. And I think the Westminster group was probably the first part that Nicola Sturgeon realised she had lost control over. She wasn't close to that group anyway, and I think you've worked at Westminster, you know that more than I. But the Stephen Flynn, challenging Ian Blackford, and he wasn't challenging Ian Blackford, and suddenly he was challenging Ian Blackford, and Ian Blackford, resigned suddenly. Then Alison Dulles was put up, which was very much seen as the, I'll just come in to, sort the kids out kind of thing. And then she didn't win. And I think that was the first sign of there was, serious, they were treading their own path in Westminster Group. Yeah, and then the rebels at Holyrood, the 9 rebels who, cleverly had 9, which was too many to get rid of them, too many to lose the whip. Otherwise, you would have lost your majority. Mm-hmm. So I think that is quite difficult to kind of get your head around. And so here's my assertion to this, that I think Nicola was going to stand down at the special conference, and I think that's why it was moved to March, because they talked about it in the new year, it's supposed to be January. And then before you know it, it was like really weirdly in the middle of March, which is Mother's Day as well, which I also thought was a bit odd, which is this Sunday coming, should have been the special conference. So for something that was a preempted decision at the Supreme Court that they put to the Supreme Court and actually was heard just after their annual conference, and then actually reported back probably a lot quicker than they'd anticipated. I think the kind of word on the street was it would probably be the early new year. So I think the Supreme Court coming back in November was quite a surprise. So then it was like, we'll have a conference in the new year, because people would have said, if we'd said, we'll have it in 4 months' time, people would have went, it's hardly an emergency then. But the fact that got moved out, I think the plan was to step down there, because if you think of when Nicola came on the scene, obviously she's been in the SNP a long time, but when she came on the scene as leader, the kind of handover was the big hydro moment, and you see that picture a lot. It's very kind of vainglorious of the crowd, and you see it from the back. It's really kind of spectacular. You see the kind of crowds at the hydro. So I think that was probably the plan, to end on that with an audience of support, but I'm not going to speculate as to why it happened much quicker, but it definitely took everybody by surprise. I mean, everybody that I know was not expecting that to happen that Wednesday morning.
So that's how we ended up with Kate as a front runner.
Well, we did, but I don't think Kate had intended to stand at that time. She was on maternity leave until April. So I think if Kate Forbes and her team, who are kind of MSPs, if that group of people had thought that this was going to be something that was happening, if you think about the 19th of March as a conference, then that is a reasonable time to say, well, April's only a couple of weeks after that she's come back from maternity leave. So I think this has brought everything hugely forward, which is kind of interesting. So the candidates that have come out, we talked before about the 77-day process and how that has been rapidly changed around in an emergency meeting. I don't understand why. I mean, Nicola Sturgeon's still there, and she said that she'll still be there, and John Swinney's still there, although he's announced he's not going to stand, as deputy leader, which is a point.
He also announced though that he was going to remain neutral. He's not managed to do that. So.
Well, no, I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, I think this is what the SNP have to be very, very careful of. At the moment, they are saying things and almost contradicting themselves in the same sentence. Some people. So they need to be very, very careful, because the electorate are watching them, and for a long time, it's been pretty much a wheelie bin where Rosette would have won a seat for the SNP. But, now people are starting to be a bit more nuanced. And this is exactly what happened to Labour. And I'm not saying Labour are going to do the big tsunami switch that the SNP did in 2015. But I do think, when you're looking at a party that's been very dominant across the whole party, you can never take the electorate for granted. And there's a few things that have bothered me from some of the candidates, particularly when they talk about the soft nose, and it's like you're taking for granted, and people have actually said, I think Kate actually said, everybody in this room will be voting for independence. I mean, that is a fair assertion, they're SNP members, but I think we need to be careful that we don't take for granted people who voted yes in 2014 will, out of some moral obligation, vote yes, because there was a lot of people who had to be very, very convinced and cajoled into that this was the right thing to do to even sign up to register to vote. And the RIC actually did a huge amount of that work in getting disenfranchised people from poll tax days back onto the electoral roll, which is why
we've eroded
84% turnout.
A lot of that's been eroded though, because they then went after them for council tax, which made no sense. But we need to focus here. We're getting off topic here. We need to talk about Kate and her policies, because there's something quite interesting about Kate. Kate is probably the only candidate putting forward what would be considered a more centre-right agenda. I think I've picked up on that. She does talk left, but
there's a lot of sound bites. But unpacking the sound bites, I think, and then looking at evidence of experience. So this is where Humza and Kate really have a problem. In the same way Rishi Sunak had a problem when he was standing to be the leader of the Tories, having been the Chancellor. You can't distance yourself from a government you were a part of when you were in the cabinet. You can't distance yourself for financial decisions made or decisions on health. And let's be honest, Humza's had a few portfolios that are pretty significant, which haven't exactly glory. Yeah, exactly. And kept getting moved about. I mean, I would think if you're really good at a job, you would stay in it rather than keeping it moved around. But anyway, that aside, so for Kate on the policies, obviously from a Commonweal point of view, free ports are not something. If you were working towards enabling an independent Scotland, as it's been talked about by Ash Regan about the commission which is about all the kind of enablers to build the readiness, I think she called it, readiness towards independence. If you were thinking you were moving towards an independent country, would you ever go down the Freeport route? I would suggest no. That you would not go down the Freeport route. You would go down the port route, and that's the stuff that the membership talked about at conference. They talked about opening up Scotland's infrastructure ports.
In fairness to Kate, the people of the north, the Invernessians that I heard,
Yeah.
were certainly they certainly thought there was something to explore with the three-port thing, but I suppose that
Has it
comes
been
down to the
explored,
UK
though?
government. Well, I think the UK government have obviously put an awful lot of positive spin on it, which is obviously spilled over. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to just having a better port system, and you're right on that.
Yeah.
Kate certainly, I think from the polling we've seen, Kate's doing quite well in that because she attracts the most Lib Dems, she attracts the most Conservative voters, and she probably gets more of the sort of centre to centre right voters, which it's really interesting because everybody pretends that Scotland's this left or centre left country, which it isn't. I mean, if you look at the polling data, the vast majority sit probably closer to the centre than they do to the left. That's just, it pains a lot of people to hear this fact, but it's probably true, and the polling seems to substantiate that. Kate has also, I think she's probably the biggest advocate on the panel. Haven't heard much from Hums on this, but Kate is probably the biggest proponent for the EU, for the rejoining of EU as it was.
Yeah, I've got a problem with that as well. So my problem is not with the EU, it's that the currency and the EU position just don't add up. You can't join the EU with your own currency.
Yeah. But she is, I would say she's strongest for it, though. She is strongest for the EU. I think, Humza's position is based. I don't know. Nicola Sturgeon didn't get us back in the EU, so I'm not going to. Kate's position is EU, and Ash Regan's position is EU using the magic backdoor, which is EFTA. I mean, EFTA's quite useful as well, and there's something that the commentators, I mean, everybody's going daft saying that you can't just use EFTA as a stopping block, and I don't know whether that or not that's true.
Finland did.
Certainly, nobody who's joined EFTA has then graduated to the EU. That's true. That is true. However, it's probably because EFTA.
Finland did. Finland were in EFTA for 9 years.
Oh well then, there I am. I stand corrected. But EFTA allows you to retain control over fisheries and agriculture, which, if you remember, were the two pain points in Scotland about the EU. So to be honest, it's possibly... I'm sensing Ash Regan is, in a sense, more in tune with the communities of the north. Certainly some of the... We've kind of covered Kate there. Let's do the final one, which is Ash Regan. She seems more in touch with the communities of the north. She spoke about if you look at her policy platform anyway, she spoke about the A9, the dualling of the A9 and A96. No. She spoke about oil jobs, and she spoke about how the transition to net zero can't come at the cost of oil jobs being. Wasted while we're importing energy. That's a really good point. It's not something you would have expected the SNP to say, it must be said. And then certainly I sense from her a more pragmatic stance on agriculture and fisheries through EFTA, in the sense that she's a bit like, well, let's not annoy the fishermen, let's not annoy the farmers. Like there is a success here. And then the bit that she's not mentioned, and it's curious that she's not mentioned it, is EFTA makes it a lot easier to trade with the rest of the UK. Yeah. Because you can effectively... EFTA doesn't have to be border free, whereas the EU does have to be border free. So, EFTA doesn't have the same... non-movement restrictions that the EU has. There is certainly common travel areas are within the EU, are within EFTA, and can be applied to the EU for unequivocal access, but with restriction on you still have to go through the. I mean, you can see that any airport you go through, it has the EFTA little flag. It has the little EFTA countries with their flags, and tells you that you have to go through its own route and everything. So it's quite clever that way. But more generally, Ash Regan, I don't know if I'm wrong in this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, she seems to have, and I haven't even mentioned independence yet, seems to have the densest policy platform, and I think that comes down to she's taking a lot from a lot of the groups that are out there, Scottish Currency Group, the Common Wheel, certainly people who've been advocating for EFTA, she's taking a real interest in that, and then her independence strategy is actually a strategy, whereas the other two don't have one. The problem that Ash Regan seems to have, though, is despite the fact she actually has a strategy that we would advocate for and we support here on the blog, is that she is not great at doing media. She is a great communicator. I don't think she's a bad communicator because I understand what she's saying, but I think she's not as smooth as Hamza or Kate or Nicola Sturgeon. You know, if you hold Nicola Sturgeon up and then you hold Ash Regan up, Nicola Sturgeon is a people pleaser. She is a communicator to the lowest common denominator. She's someone who people feel assuaged by her soothing tones. I think Ash Regan's certainly a lot jaggier, but from my point of view, are we electing somebody that sounds good or somebody who is good?
So this is what I think. This is what I think even. Too tired. That Ash Regan comes across as somebody who's got more life experience and is more mature rather than having been a professional politician. You know, she said herself she's got a business background. I know she's worked at Commonwealth and she's been an activist before she's been a politician. So for Ash, and I think this is what comes across, it comes from, it's like the kind of the fire in your gut. It's like the passion of things, and I think that's why the independence planning has been. We needed a solution here. Let's get heads together. And I think to do the Independence Convention, which has actually got a track record, the Constitutional Convention after the 79 devolution referendum actually made a huge change in actually normalising that. And by the time the Labour government came into power, it was actually 74%. So the settled will went from, you know, the contended, you know, like majority, but then they brought in the rule, 40% rule, etc. So it was really difficult to argue with the fact that this has worked before. And actually, even if it hadn't, bringing people together in a room to socialise arguments and debate builds consensus. I mean, doing project work, the first thing you do is you do a project kick-off. You set out here's our North Star, here's what we're aiming for, what are the ideas, how we're going to do that, break that down, where's your areas of specialism. All that makes sense. And the idea of the Commission of the Readiness also makes sense because all the things we learned, you know, you and I love doing retrospectives because it's where you learn. You know, you learn from your mistakes more than anything else. That's how you move the dial, as it were. So if you look to what went wrong in 2014, what went right in 2014, do more of what went right, check if it's still valid, what did we not do, what new ideas have we got, but mostly the pay dirt really is, where did it go wrong? You know, so currency and borders and all these things and pensions, all these things. Since then, we've had groups like Believe in Scotland have done a lot of work. You know, the Business for Scotland guys have done a lot of work on pensions. There's a lot of work on, you know, the currency and the Scottish Currency Group, and there's a lot of work on borders and some of the groups I know down in the south of Scotland. You know, there's a lot of this work being done already. And to shut the door to that as a party of government is bananas. You know, it really is. So I think that's where the kind of freshness came in. But the pragmatic thing on all the policies, if you actually listen to what Ash Regan says for all the things, whether it's A9, whether it's the net zero transition in oil and gas industry and just transition, everything, it's all about pragmatism. It's all about looking at, okay, you know, it might not be in the detail, but, you know, no First Minister is going to do every job. No First Minister is going to write the budget and set out all the policy plans. That's why you have a government. That's why you have a cabinet. That's why you have junior ministers. That's why you have advisors.
I was dismayed to see people making fun of her for saying that she was going to have more groups and she was going to speak to people and she was going to put smart people in the room. Like,
put the converse to that. I'm not going to listen to anybody. I'm just going to do it all myself. It's not in my head. It's not happening. I mean, that's mad.
That's a huge failing of the Sturgeon administration. The idea that one person should be carrying all the cans.
But I do think that is a kind of the downside of having somebody who's such a dominant personality like Nicola Sturgeon. And to be fair, Alex Salmon before, I think there's a perception. There's a kind of pedestal perception that really doesn't do either of the individuals any good, you know, personally, because if you put somebody up on a pedestal, it's fairly easy to knock them down, particularly if you've got a hostile media and a hostile opposition. So I think spreading the risk, and we've talked about this before, the whole chemical reaction thing, smaller particles, more surface area, the more you have across, then the harder it is to target that. And also, the more, energy and ideas, the more components can bang off each other, kick the tires, get more robust solutions going out. Because I think we've got a really lazy legislation of kind of lobbying on turning into kind of fag packet legislation. And back to where we started in this conversation, there's so many pieces of legislation in the last few years have not actually got into law. They've either been pulled down in the Supreme Court, like the UN Rights of the Child, or the Named Persons Bill, or the Offence Behaviour Football,
Right.
and now we've got the GRR and the whole debacle over that, which I don't believe will it ever go. I think there's a lot of political lies going on at the moment. They've only got a month, and I don't think if they were going to do it, Nicola Sturgeon would have done it. And I don't believe anybody, no matter what they're saying, will take that bill to the Supreme Court, because it'll have to go through the court session.
I also think that there's the other angle, which is that, the Alba Party, initially, a lot of the commentators in the Alba Party suddenly started talking about how Ash Regan's the future and how she's fantastic, everything. And then she got tagged with being Alex Salmond's candidate. But what was quite funny about that is, I'm a former Alba member a long, long time ago. But they've been sending near daily reminders that I am a lapsed member and that I should rejoin. Now, I've not had one of them in about a year, which tells me that the really funny thing that I've enjoyed is, obviously, Alba established itself in a March. And if you signed up early, they still don't have yearly renewal enabled. So the truth is there's an awful lot of people who keep falling off. Now, we warned them about that at the time. But they're sending out renewals, and it makes me think that Ash Regan is actually a threat to the Alba Party, to the continued existence of the Alba Party. They've went, well, wait a minute. That lady's saying things that we find quite popular. We might run to that. It's quite funny that the Alba Party have been outmanoeuvred in an SNP leadership election. However, we're at 46 minutes. We must draw to a close. Okay. So
I think that's what's really interesting, just quickly, on being non-partisan, that you can actually see these things. And we see it very much in a vision of independence and not through a kind of party political spin. But, there's a lot of kind of moving and shaking going about to see who's got which piece of turf. But I would stress to anybody listening, if you support independence, there's a whole pitch to cover. There's things that individuals do better. Let's stop bumping into each other and breaking each other's legs. Let's actually look at the open goals the opposition's leaving and focus and start facing the same direction.
So we have a voting system, okay? And a lot of people don't realise this. You actually don't vote for one. If you're an SNP member, you don't vote for one leadership candidate. You can vote for three. You can actually vote for all three if you so wish. So we're going to cover, before we give a recommendation, we will finish on our recommendation, but we're going to cover this for you. An STV election is a very interesting election because it means your vote, if you don't get your first choice, you get your second choice, and if you don't get your second choice, you get your third choice. Now, given there are only three choices, you can technically always win. So you can rank the candidates 1, 2 and 3. Doing so doesn't really make any difference. You need to rank the first two. You do not have to rank the third. Okay, the third makes no difference at this point. Simply, I could lay it out on screen, but the system we use doesn't allow us to do screen share just now. But effectively, if you vote for your third vote will never get counted because one candidate will get knocked out, and the second round will be the winning round. So you don't need to vote a third
one blank is the same as putting a number 3. It's the same effect.
Yeah, so if you want to put a number 3, put a number 3 if you really want to vote for them all, so you can say I voted for you and try and extract something out of them later. But here's what is important. Here is the important thing in this one. You need to vote for the leader that you want to lead the SNP. Do not think about First Minister. There's a confirmatory vote for that. That means that you cannot game that. The Scottish Parliament have to play that game. You're not a person who gets to play in that game, and that's a simple yes or no, simple majority wins. It doesn't even have to be majority of the Parliament. You are only voting for the leader of the SNP, and you should only cast your vote in that sense because you can't influence the outcome of the next part. Focus on that. And think about your first vote and the weight that you give to the argument that the individual is putting forward. It's very important you do this. A lot of people are thinking, I'll vote for the personality I want. That will not move the party forward. You need to think about that before you vote. The person who speaks to you is the person you should vote for. If that's Kate Forbes, it's Kate Forbes. If it's Ash Regan, it's Ash Regan. If it's Hamza Youssef, it's Hamza Youssef. And secondly, you should use a second choice. You should always use a second choice in in an STV election that has three people, because this is where you can deny the person who's furthest from your position from winning. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people have said Ash Regan, and this is where we're going to come on to our recommendation, and I'm presuming Alison's going to agree with me here, and I'm going to let her in rather than talking endlessly in a second. That if you want Ash Regan's policies, do not go into this thinking Ash Regan is not going to win. You should go into this voting for Ash Regan. And you should and that is our suggestion, or at least my suggestion is you vote for Ash Regan because she's the only one that has an independence plan. She's the only one that's going to delegate and open it up. And I'm more than confident she's going to harness the best talents in the room. I am confident from everything she's said. She is not a person who talks in doublespeak. She's not a political operator. She's very clearly someone who just lets out her thoughts, repeats things that she thinks are good ideas, and she's got a record already of bringing clever people into the room. So we would say vote Ash Regan 1, and secondly I would say vote Kate Forbes 2, because I think the worst thing that could happen for the SNP just now is to be led by a continuity candidate who wants to do more of the same. And Alison, you?
Yeah, I completely agree, and I would add that in the short timescale, it's been 3 weeks since the contest opened. Ash Regan's actually progressed a huge amount in that time, whereas the other kind of polished candidates who've been cabinet ministers, particularly Humza Yousaf, have to, where can he grow? Where can he actually improve? And I think this is what we need to look at for Scotland. If Scotland is going to move the dial from this stasis of 50%, we need fresh energy and ideas. We need something that is going to change. And I think, Kate's very much seen as I see Kate as kind of devolution candidate. I think she would be a very good First Minister in an independent Scotland. But I cannot see from what she's talked about gentle persuasion, how gentle persuasion with, a better communicator in Nicola Sturgeon hasn't moved this along. So I think we actually need something more. We need an evolution in the way we look at this. And I don't think, just to rhyme it off, I don't think Humza's the solution, because I think that would just be more of the same. So for me, I would agree. You always use your 2 votes. If you want change, I think there's real fundamental change for independence. And I think Scottish people have been convinced out of their power for a long time. And I think it's very refreshing to hear, Ash Regan saying actually the power belongs to people. And that's something I very much believe in. Demos Kratos is power of the people. And I think taking it out of the hands of politicians and putting it back to people, it holds the politicians' feet to the fire. If they don't do enough work to convince, they will not get over the 50%. And I think we should be aiming for, it's a democratic bar like anybody else. Why should Scotland be held to a higher bar? But I think we should aim to get as high over that bar as possible. Not move the bar, but get over.
So in summary, if you want continuity as it is exactly right now and no progress, you should vote Humza Yousaf number 1. If you want devolution delivered and you want somebody who understands that quite well, Kate Forbes number 1. And if you want Ash Regan to lead us to independence and to chart a new way forward with new ideas, vote Ash Regan number 1. You have the vote, and we wish you well. Our final recommendation is that you vote Ash Regan 1, Kate Forbes 2, and if you really must use your third vote, you can put Humza Yousaf in there, but it will count for nothing on the transfers. This has been a very special edition of the Viva Cost podcast. I've been Graham Spence. Alison's been Alison Graham.
I have.
Good night and goodbye.
Good night and good luck.
And it begins tomorrow.